Statistics about Gen Z and religion. Share of the population who have no religious affiliation. Each color is a different year here. I'm most interested in 2022. Clearly, Gen Z is the least religious of all of them, with 48% in 2022, but it does look like every generation, except for maybe Silent Generation, gets less religious over time. For boomers, Gen X, and millennials, it seems like the most religious change happened between 2008 and 2012. Look at these big gaps that we've got in between those years. Although for millennials, it seems like 2016 to 2020 was a pretty big jump too. This graph comes from this channel's favorite social scientist, Dr. Ryan Burge. The article is titled Gen Z and Religion in 2022. Now, the data comes from the Cooperative Election Study administered by YouGov in 2022. This is recent data. This study and this article only look at the United States, but we will be looking at some statistics in a bit from other parts of the world. They tell a very different story than what we're seeing in the United States. To give you a little hint, Gen Z is not just becoming less religious around the world. Something stranger is happening. Stay tuned. Religious breakdown by generation. It's wild just how much Christianity has declined with every single generation, pretty evenly too. Protestantism has definitely seen the biggest decline proportionally. If you look at atheist and agnostic and nothing in particular, then you see that there's a pretty big jump in those categories between Gen X and millennials. Other world religions has grown over time, but not really by that much. 9% in Gen Z, 6% in the Silent Generation. Lastly, if you look at these two categories for Gen Z, then you see that about half of Gen Z is not religious. So I think obviously we're seeing a huge number of people leave Christianity and become and stay non-religious. But I don't think that we've seen the full extent of this trend in Gen Z just yet. In this previous video, I read from a Pew Research article that said, for example, we estimate that 31% of people raised Christian become unaffiliated between ages 15 to 29, the tumultuous period in which religious switching is concentrated. An additional 7% of people raised Christian become unaffiliated later in life after the age of 30. So, since the oldest of Gen Z were born in 1996 and are only just reaching the age of 27, none of them have yet made it all the way through this tumultuous period where leaving Christianity is so concentrated. This makes me think that as time goes on, we'll actually see them become more non-religious statistically. Religious service attendance by generation. Given the last stats, you'd expect this to smoothly and steeply decline, but that's not exactly what we see. Gen X is actually the generation that attends religious services the least. It goes up in millennials and up a bit more in Gen Z if you want to count yearly attendees. That's not that much. Again, I do really wonder if Gen Z's attendance is going to go down over time because some of them are probably still going to church with their parents, so we may see that decline even more. I'd imagine the Silent Generation is in disapproval of the rest of us who go to church way less than them. All right, yeah, I'm sure we're all seeing the trend here, but in some places globally, things look very different for Gen Z. Next up, we'll look at statistics from a survey of 26 countries. The data was gathered by ISPOS, which is a multinational market research firm. Okay, religious identification by country, and this is our 26 countries. India, Thailand, Turkey, South Africa, Peru, Singapore, Mexico, Colombia, Poland, Brazil, Italy, Argentina, United States, Chile, Hungary, Canada, France, Germany, Spain, Australia, Belgium, Great Britain, Netherlands, Sweden, South Korea, Japan. Whew. I do find this selection of countries a bit random. You have a few countries in the global south, mainly the Americas. You have a lot of Europe, and then a random smattering of countries from East Asia, like Japan, Singapore, Thailand. There's a lot going on here, so let's move on to one that makes it easier to digest. 26 country average by gender and generation. Yeah, this is an average of these 26 countries, so it is not representative of the whole world or any one specific country. Christianity has trended down consistently like in the US, although maybe not as steeply. Here's something really different though. No religion is more common among boomers than Gen Z. It's just a little bit, but that stands out to me. Also, Islam and other religions seem to be more popular among younger people, Gen Z and millennials, than older generations. I think this one will give us a better, more detailed picture of what we're looking at here. Generation gap by country, Catholic and Protestant/evangelical. This is a breakdown of Gen Z and boomers. So when it's negative, that means that Gen Z is less of this thing than boomers. And when it's positive, that means there's more Gen Z that are this thing than boomers. Of course, we see Christianity declining in most places, and it's pretty significant. It seems to me that there's a little bit more Catholic in Gen Z among places that were traditionally more Protestant. Australia, South Africa, Great Britain, and Sweden. Meanwhile, in places that were traditionally more Catholic, there's growth in Protestantism among Gen Z. So places like Hungary and Argentina, Mexico, France, they're all increasing pretty significantly here. I guess that's their way of rebelling against their elders, eating the cracker different and singing different songs. I wonder if Gen Z Catholics like the Pope more than boomer Catholics. That's a question I'd like to see answered. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Generation gap by country, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu. Gen Z is more Muslim in 14 countries, and in some countries like Great Britain, Sweden, Belgium, it's a lot. Oh, Turkey too. Okay, so the other countries, I would think that this has to do with immigration, but in Turkey, I have heard that generations before today's were more secular and that their government was more interested in maintaining secularism than it is now. Correct me if I'm wrong. Over to Buddhist, in Japan, Gen Z is way less Buddhist than boomers, and in Singapore, they're just as much in the other direction. South Korea's had a pretty big drop in Buddhists too. Here's what I think is maybe the most surprising statistic on this to me. In India, Gen Z is a bit more Hindu than boomers. I would have thought that Gen Z was becoming maybe a little bit more secular, but more Hindu? Guys, let me know how that works. I'm not sure why that is. Generation gap by country, no religion, and prefer not to say. For no religion, it seems that there are mostly big changes one way or the other. South Korea and Italy seem to be going through a lot of change, but Brazil, Poland, Peru, South Africa, and Belgium all seem to be making a lot of change too. The prefer not to say thing is pretty interesting. I've never seen this question asked in a survey like this before, but I will say that Japan being the biggest here does not surprise me. Let me read you a comment I got recently. I grew up partially in Japan, and one of our sayings was, "You're born Shinto, married Christian, and die Buddhist," which is to say your birth is celebrated as the entrance to a pure life, Shinto purity. Most marriages take place at a Christian church, though you do not have to be Christian to partake, and also a large minority of marriages are still done in a traditional Shinto style with some Christian influences. And your funeral will take place at a Buddhist temple, since Buddhism is most heavily concerned with the passing on of one life to the next. All this said, while Japan has a lot of religious customs that people get emotionally involved in the spiritual with, most Japanese people probably don't consider themselves religious. Very superstitious, yes, but not religious. After pointing this out, all my Japanese friends tend to reluctantly concede that they are religious to a significant extent, even though they don't identify with any particular religion. Very interesting, I think. Maybe they prefer not to say because the answer is just so complicated? Although I may be reading into that too much. Maybe they're just trying to be polite or something. All right, on to the next one. Belief in God or a higher power by demographics. Again, Gen Z believes in God more often than boomers in places that have larger populations of Muslims. So Turkey, Great Britain, Germany, Hungary, and Sweden. That jump in Sweden is huge. I did not realize that. Us atheists in the US like to uphold Sweden as this incredibly atheistic kind of utopia. And it seems like young people believe in God a lot more than maybe we tend to think. But still, in a lot of places, Gen Z is less inclined to believe in God than boomers. Okay, so here are the global averages for this same metric, belief in God. Gen Z actually says, "I do not believe in God or a higher power of any kind," the least out of these generations. Remember, viewers in the English-speaking, mostly Christian world, this does not mean that Gen Z is more Christian. They are less Christian than boomers, but they do believe in God, in this global average more often than boomers. I am curious if this could change as they get older. Like I mentioned before, people tend to switch out of at least Christianity mostly between the ages of 15 and 29. There are no 29-year-old Gen Z yet. Maybe by the time they're mostly in their 30s and 40s, they'll be less religious, but it really could be the opposite. Who's to say? All right, on to our last one here, perspectives on religion and the generation gap there. This is the global average again. I am completely comfortable around people who have different religious beliefs than me. Gen Z is actually a little tiny bit less likely to say that. In Germany, they're a lot more likely to say that, and in Mexico and South Korea, they're a lot less likely to say that than boomers. Religious practices are an important factor in the moral life of my country's citizens. More Gen Z tend to agree with this. And would you look at that, it seems like places that have more young Muslims are the places that tend to say this a lot more. People with a religious faith are happier. Gen Z is more likely to say this too. And basically the same list of countries. It seems to be young Muslims who are really swaying this. Religion does more harm in the world than good. Gen Z says this less than boomers. Boomers say this more often in places with a lot of young Muslims. My religion defines me as a person. Gen Z says this a little more often, and could you guess by now, it's mostly young Muslims who seem to be swaying this. People with a religious faith are better citizens. Same story as the last one. I lose respect for people when I find out that they do not have a religious faith. This one's the biggest yikes for me, and it's the one that Gen Z seems to support the most, and yeah, it seems that places with more young Muslims say this more often. However, you do have places like Singapore, Spain, Australia, and Canada who have an increase in Gen Z saying this without having tons of new Muslims there. Some of these give me the impression that young Muslims are kind of conservative in their thinking. They seem to think that they have an exclusive grasp on truth, morality, meaning. So interesting, because in the US, that's the attitude that you expect of older people, definitely not of Gen Z. Okay, that is it. So what have we learned? In the US, religion is declining with every generation, and Gen Z is, by a good bit, the least religious generation in recent history. In many other countries, particularly those where Christianity has been more dominant, we see the same pattern. However, in countries where Islam is growing, like Germany, the UK, Sweden especially, Gen Z is more religious than boomers. Remember that the statistics we looked at in this video only cover a fraction of countries. There are huge global players like Indonesia, Nigeria, Iran, Pakistan, Russia that we didn't talk about at all. With the data we have, though, it seems to me that we're approaching an era of greater religious pluralism globally, where being non-religious is common and where secularism and Islam interact a lot more often. How will religion, especially Islam, I think, change as a result? What will it be like to be non-religious in a world where there's no meaningful dichotomy between Christianity and non-belief? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A thank you to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, then subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to each other in the comments, regardless of where you're from or what your religion is. And until next time, stay skeptical.